The Billionaire Who Risked It All to Find Family, An Unforgettable Journey. Christopher Brooks stood by the towering glass windows of his Manhattan penthouse, the city sprawling out beneath him like a sea of restless ambition. The hum of late-night traffic and the occasional glow of helicopter lights punctuated the silence, but Christopher barely noticed. At 40, he was the epitome of success, founder of Brooks Tech, a multi-billion-dollar technology empire that revolutionized artificial intelligence. His name graced Forbes covers, and his decisions moved markets. Yet, in this rare, quiet moment, he felt a hollowness that no accolade or business deal could fill. Behind him, the faint clink of ice against crystal signaled Bianca's presence. His wife of 7 years, a celebrated fashion designer, was as striking as ever in her silk evening gown. But their glamorous life, filled with award galas and luxurious getaways, had lost its luster for Christopher. "Why are you so quiet tonight?" Bianca's voice was as smooth and practiced as her runway walks. She perched elegantly on the white leather sofa, a glass of wine in hand. Christopher turned from the window, his sharp blue eyes locking with hers. For weeks, he'd wrestled with the decision, knowing it would challenge the very foundation of their relationship. But tonight, the words came out steady, firm. "I've decided I want a child, Bianca," he said. Her expression froze, the elegance slipping from her face as disbelief gave way to frustration. "We've discussed this," she said sharply, setting her glass down. "Children don't fit into our life. They never have." "No," Christopher countered, his voice calm but resolute. "They don't fit into your life. I've respected that for years, but I can't ignore what I feel anymore. I want a family, Bianca. I'm going to adopt." The air between them thickened with tension. Bianca's laughter, bitter and disbelieving, broke the silence. "Adopt? Are you serious? You can't just add a baby to your life like a business acquisition, Christopher." Her words stung, but Christopher stood his ground. "I'm serious. I've already started the process." Bianca's face hardened, her composure shattering. Without another word, she stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Left alone in the cavernous penthouse, Christopher exhaled deeply. The emptiness that had plagued him felt sharper now, but alongside it was a glimmer of something else: hope. The days that followed Bianca's explosive reaction were filled with a heavy silence that lingered in the penthouse. Christopher had anticipated her anger, but the cold distance that replaced their usual rhythm was harder to bear. Still, he remained resolute. He had made his decision. Christopher sat at his desk one evening, reviewing the final documents from the adoption agency. The process was rigorous, even for someone of his stature, but he welcomed the scrutiny. This wasn't just another venture to be conquered, it was deeply personal. His phone buzzed, breaking his focus. Bianca's name lit up the screen, and for a moment, he hesitated. When he finally answered, her voice was icy. "Are you really going through with this?" she demanded. "I am," Christopher replied evenly. "I've already spoken to the agency. It's happening." Her bitter laugh echoed through the line. "You'll ruin everything. Our freedom, our lifestyle, everything we've worked for. Do you even know what raising a child entails?" "Bianca," he said firmly, "I've built empires, navigated challenges most people can't imagine. I can handle this. More importantly, I want to handle this." Her silence on the other end was deafening before she finally muttered, "Don't expect me to be part of this." The line went dead, leaving Christopher with the weight of his resolve. He knew this would drive an even deeper wedge between them, but his heart had already made its choice. A week later, he received the call that would change his life forever. The adoption agency had found a match, a newborn baby boy, abandoned just hours after birth. The details were minimal. No family history, no attachments. A blank slate waiting to be filled with love and care. Christopher arrived at the hospital the next morning, a bundle of nerves hidden beneath his tailored suit. The nurse greeted him warmly and led him to the small, sterile room where the baby waited. As he stepped inside, his breath caught. The infant was swaddled tightly in a white blanket, his tiny face calm and serene. When the nurse gently placed the baby in Christopher's arms, he felt an unfamiliar rush of emotions. "He's been waiting for you," the nurse said with a smile. Christopher gazed down at the baby's face, his deep brown eyes opening briefly as if to meet his. In that instant, something inside Christopher shifted, a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed, a love that transcended logic or fear. "Welcome home, Oliver," he whispered, his voice trembling. Back at the penthouse, Christopher carefully placed Oliver in the nursery he had prepared. Every detail had been meticulously chosen. Soft, neutral tones, a crib crafted from the finest materials, shelves lined with books he imagined reading to him someday. As the city buzzed on outside, Christopher sat in the rocking chair, cradling the tiny bundle that now held his entire world. That evening, Bianca's name flashed on his phone again. He answered, bracing himself. "What do you want?" he said curtly. Her tone was sharp. "Have you lost your mind? You've actually done it?" "I have," he replied, glancing at Oliver, who was peacefully sleeping in his arms. "His name is Oliver." Bianca's laugh was harsh. "Do you really think this is sustainable? You're a billionaire, Christopher. You don't have time for diaper changes and midnight feedings? You'll ruin your life." Christopher's voice was calm but resolute. "Then maybe this isn't the life for you. If you can't accept him, maybe you should leave." The line went silent before abruptly cutting off. Christopher sighed, the exhaustion of the day settling in. But as he looked at Oliver, he felt something he hadn't in years: purpose. This wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Christopher Brooks knew exactly what he was fighting for. The morning Christopher went to bring Oliver home was one he would never forget. The world outside the hospital was draped in a soft gray haze, and the air carried a chill that bit through his tailored overcoat. As he stepped into the hospital lobby, the sterile scent of disinfectant mixed with the muted hum of activity around him. Christopher wasn't a man who often felt nervous, but today was different. Today, he wasn't closing a deal or preparing for a high-stakes negotiation. He was about to meet his son. The nurse greeted him warmly. "Mr. Brooks, right this way," she said, her kind smile doing little to ease the tension in his chest. They walked down a quiet hallway until they arrived at a small, brightly lit room. Christopher froze in the doorway, his heart pounding. There, lying in a simple bassinet, was Oliver. The baby's tiny form was swaddled in a pale blue blanket, his face serene, his chest rising and falling with each delicate breath. "He's beautiful, isn't he?" the nurse said, her voice soft as she gestured for Christopher to step inside. Christopher swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the bassinet. The moment he laid eyes on Oliver's face, a wave of emotion surged through him: joy, fear, love, and a profound sense of responsibility all at once. "Would you like to hold him?" the nurse asked. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. She gently lifted Oliver from the bassinet and placed him in Christopher's arms. The baby stirred slightly, his tiny hand brushing against Christopher's chest, and in that moment, the billionaire who had built an empire felt completely unprepared for the enormity of what lay ahead. "Hey, little guy," Christopher murmured, his voice barely audible. "I'm your dad." Oliver's eyes fluttered open briefly, and Christopher swore he saw a flicker of recognition in the baby's gaze. Tears prickled at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away, unwilling to let himself appear vulnerable even in this private moment. "He's been waiting for you," the nurse said with a gentle smile. The words hit Christopher like a punch to the gut. He hadn't realized just how much he had been waiting too. Waiting for something, someone, to fill the void that all the wealth and power in the world couldn't touch. Back at the penthouse, the nursery stood ready, a stark contrast to the rest of the sleek, modern home. The room was warm and inviting, decorated in soft creams and blues, with a mobile of stars and moons hanging above the crib. Christopher carried Oliver inside, his movements careful and deliberate. He laid the baby down gently in the crib and stood there for a long moment, watching him sleep. The enormity of what he had done began to settle in. He wasn't just Christopher Brooks, tech mogul and billionaire. He was now a father. That evening, as the city lights twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Christopher sat in the nursery's rocking chair, cradling Oliver in his arms. The baby stirred, letting out a soft whimper, and Christopher instinctively began to hum a lullaby, a tune he hadn't thought of since his own childhood. The sound soothed Oliver, and he quieted, his tiny hand clutching Christopher's finger. The peace was short-lived. Christopher's phone buzzed on the side table, jolting him from the moment. He saw Bianca's name flash on the screen and reluctantly answered. "Christopher," she began, her tone sharp and accusatory, "you've actually done it. You've adopted a child?" Yes, he said simply, glancing down at Oliver, who had drifted back to sleep. You're insane, Bianca spat. Do you even understand what you've done? You can't raise a baby. You're going to ruin everything. For you, for me, for this perfect life we built. Christopher took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving Oliver. His name is Oliver, he said, his voice calm but firm. And yes, I understand exactly what I've done. I've given myself and him a chance at something real, something that matters. Bianca's laughter was cold and cutting. You'll regret this, Christopher. Mark my words. Then maybe you should go, he said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. When the call finally ended, Christopher sat there for a long time, the weight of his choice pressing down on him. But as he looked at Oliver, peaceful and content in his arms, Christopher felt a spark of something he hadn't in years. Hope. This wasn't the life he had planned, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the life he was meant to live. The first weeks of parenthood were nothing short of chaos for Christopher. His once meticulously ordered life, structured down to the minute with meetings, negotiations, and carefully planned meals, was now dictated by the whims of a 6-week-old baby. Oliver had no regard for schedules. He cried at 3 a.m., needed feeding at 5 a.m., and decided the middle of the day was prime time for an epic meltdown. Christopher, used to commanding boardrooms with unwavering authority, found himself standing in the middle of his penthouse, sleep-deprived and staring helplessly at a screaming infant. He had underestimated just how challenging this would be. Late one night, after an exhausting day of juggling meetings and diaper changes, Christopher slumped into the nursery's rocking chair with Oliver in his arms. The baby's cries were shrill, piercing the quiet of the penthouse. Christopher tried bouncing him, singing softly, even pacing the room, but nothing seemed to work. You've taken down global competitors, Christopher muttered to himself, but you can't figure out why a baby is crying? Finally, sheer exhaustion overtook them both. Oliver drifted off, his tiny face relaxing against Christopher's chest. As he watched the baby sleep, Christopher couldn't help but laugh quietly at the absurdity of it all. He had built a multi-billion-dollar empire, yet nothing had prepared him for this. By day, Christopher balanced fatherhood with running Brooks Tech, often with Oliver nestled in a carrier strapped to his chest. His assistant, Claudia, was a lifesaver, managing his schedule and occasionally stepping in to help with the baby. Mr. Brooks, Claudia said one afternoon as she entered his office, holding a bottle of formula, "You're running a meeting in 5 minutes. Do you want me to take Oliver for a bit?" Christopher glanced at the baby, who was cooing softly in his lap. "No, it's fine. He can stay." The boardroom was a scene unlike anything Brooks Tech executives had ever witnessed. Christopher sat at the head of the table, delivering sharp, calculated instructions while bouncing Oliver on his knee. At one point, the baby let out a loud burp, cutting through the tense discussion. The room went silent before Christopher smiled wryly. Consider that Oliver's approval of the plan. The executives chuckled, tension easing as the meeting resumed. Christopher was learning to navigate this new reality, blending two worlds that had seemed incompatible. But not everyone was supportive. Bianca continued to call sporadically, her tone swinging between incredulous and condescending. "Are you seriously bringing a baby into meetings now?" she asked during one particularly heated conversation. "Bianca, this is my life now," Christopher replied, his voice calm but firm. "You can either accept that or not, but it's not up for debate." Her sigh on the other end was heavy with disdain. "You're going to burn out, Christopher. Mark my words." Despite her doubts, Christopher pressed on. Oliver quickly became the center of his world, his tiny presence filling the once empty penthouse with warmth and purpose. Every milestone, no matter how small, felt monumental. The first time Oliver grasped his finger, the first smile, the first time he slept through the night. Each moment reaffirmed Christopher's decision. Still, the challenges were relentless. Nights were long, sleep was scarce, and the weight of single parenthood was heavier than he'd anticipated. But amidst the exhaustion and uncertainty, Christopher found joy in the simplest moments. The way Oliver's face lit up during a game of peekaboo, the soft sound of his breathing as he slept, the sense of pride that surged every time he overcame another parenting hurdle. For a man who had spent his life chasing achievement after achievement, this was a new kind of success, one that couldn't be measured in dollars or headlines. Christopher had built an empire, but for the first time, he was building something far more important: a family. It was a quiet evening when the elevator to Christopher's penthouse dinged unexpectedly. He frowned, not expecting anyone, and glanced down at Oliver, who was nestled in his arms, finishing a bottle. He shifted the baby to his shoulder and walked toward the door. When the elevator doors slid open, there she was, Bianca. Her appearance was as striking as ever, her sleek black coat framing her tall, slender figure. But her eyes, always sharp and calculating, seemed softer, more uncertain. "What are you doing here?" Christopher asked, his voice guarded. Bianca stepped inside slowly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Her gaze fell on Oliver, who gurgled happily, oblivious to the tension. "I wanted to see him," she said finally, her tone lacking its usual edge. Christopher hesitated, every instinct telling him to shield his son from whatever Bianca's intentions might be. But he nodded, stepping aside. "His name is Oliver." Bianca approached cautiously, her movements uncharacteristically tentative. She knelt beside the armchair where Christopher sat, her manicured fingers brushing against Oliver's tiny hand. The baby cooed and giggled, and for a fleeting moment, Christopher thought he saw something crack in Bianca's icy demeanor. "He's beautiful," she said softly, her voice trembling. Christopher studied her warily. "What are you doing here, Bianca? What do you want?" She didn't look up, her focus remaining on Oliver. "I don't know," she admitted, her vulnerability catching him off guard. "I didn't think I could feel anything for a child. But seeing him—" Her voice trailed off, and Christopher's jaw tightened. He wanted to believe her, to see this as a turning point, but his instincts warned him otherwise. For the next few days, Bianca lingered. She came to the penthouse unannounced, staying for hours at a time. At first, Christopher resisted, wary of her sudden interest in Oliver. But her presence became harder to ignore. She seemed genuinely captivated by the baby, asking questions about his routine, his preferences, his milestones. She even offered to help feed him, though her inexperience was evident. Christopher found her struggles oddly endearing. Her awkward attempts to burp Oliver, the way she jumped when he cried, the determined look on her face as she tried to soothe him. Still, Christopher couldn't shake his doubts. Late one evening, after putting Oliver to bed, he confronted her. "What are you doing, Bianca?" he asked bluntly, leaning against the kitchen counter as she sipped a glass of wine. She looked up, her eyes tired but sincere. "I'm not sure," she said, setting the glass down. "Maybe I'm just trying to figure it out." Christopher's gaze hardened. "And what happens if you decide this isn't for you? What happens to Oliver then?" Bianca flinched, the weight of his words sinking in. "I wouldn't." She stopped, taking a shaky breath. "I wouldn't hurt him like that." "Forgive me if I don't trust that," Christopher said, his tone cutting. "You've made it clear how you feel about children. You don't get to walk in and out of his life whenever it suits you." Bianca's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded silently, gathering her coat and heading for the elevator. The next morning, she was back. This time, she brought a small gift, a plush bear, for Oliver. Her visits became more frequent, and slowly Christopher began to see a change in her. The sharp edges of her personality softened, her interactions with Oliver more natural, more maternal. But even as Bianca made an effort, Christopher couldn't fully let his guard down. He knew the stakes were too high. For Oliver, there was no room for inconsistency or half measures. One afternoon, as Bianca cradled Oliver in her arms, she looked up at Christopher with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Do you think people can change?" she asked quietly. Christopher studied her for a long moment before replying. "Only if they truly want to." Bianca nodded, her gaze returning to Oliver. "I think I want to try." The words hung in the air, heavy with both promise and uncertainty. And for the first time since her return, Christopher allowed himself a sliver of cautious hope. For a while, it seemed like Bianca was truly trying. Her visits to the penthouse became more frequent, her interactions with Oliver growing more natural. She held him, fed him, even hummed softly to him when she thought no one was listening. Christopher, ever watchful, remained cautious but couldn't deny the sincerity in her actions. However, cracks began to show the day Bianca's mother, Veronica, made an unannounced visit. Veronica was a force to be reckoned with, sharp-tongued, impeccably dressed, and unapologetically judgmental. Christopher had always found her overbearing, but her arrival brought an entirely new level of tension. "Christopher," Veronica said, sweeping into the penthouse like she owned it. "What is this nonsense I hear about you playing house with a baby?" Christopher, cradling Oliver, kept his tone neutral. "Good to see you too, Veronica." Bianca appeared from the hallway, her expression tight. "Mother, what are you doing here?" Veronica turned to her daughter, her gaze icy. "I came to see if you've completely lost your mind. A baby, Bianca? This isn't you." Her disdainful glance flicked to Oliver, and Christopher felt his patience fray. "Theo," he said firmly. "His name is Oliver, and he's my son." "Your son," Veronica scoffed. "This is absurd. Christopher, you're a businessman, not a babysitter. This emotional experiment will ruin you." Bianca shifted uncomfortably, but for the first time she stood her ground. "Mother, stop," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "Oh, now you're defending this madness?" Veronica's arched brow rose. "Since when did you want children? You've always said they weren't for you." Bianca's gaze fell to Oliver, who gurgled happily in Christopher's arms. "Things have changed," she said softly. Veronica's laugh was bitter. "You're deluding yourself. This isn't who you are, Bianca. You're not cut out for this." "That's enough," Christopher interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "You don't get to decide who Bianca is or what she's capable of, and you certainly don't get to insult my son in his own home." Veronica glared at him, but he didn't flinch. After a tense moment, she turned back to Bianca. "Think carefully, dear. You're throwing away everything we built for. This." Without waiting for a reply, Veronica strode to the elevator and disappeared, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Bianca stood frozen, her hands trembling. Christopher approached her cautiously. "Are you okay?" "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's not your fault," Christopher said gently, "but you need to decide whose voice matters more, hers or yours." Bianca didn't respond. Instead, she walked into the nursery, closing the door softly behind her. Over the following days, the weight of her mother's words seemed to bear down on Bianca. Her visits became less frequent, her once earnest efforts with Oliver now half-hearted. Christopher noticed the shift and confronted her one evening. "Talk to me," he said, his tone firm yet concerned. Bianca hesitated, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't know if I can do this, Christopher. I thought I could change, but maybe my mother's right. This isn't who I am." Christopher's chest tightened, anger and heartbreak warring within him. "You don't get to decide this halfway, Bianca, not with Oliver involved. He needs people who are all in. If you can't be that, you need to walk away." Her tears fell freely now, and she whispered, "I just need time." "Time isn't a luxury we have, Bianca," Christopher replied, his voice unwavering. "Not when it comes to him." It was clear. The turning point had come. The question now was whether Bianca would rise to the challenge or walk away for good. 2 weeks after Bianca stopped visiting, Christopher found himself adjusting to life without the lingering uncertainty she had brought. He poured all his focus into Oliver, finding solace in the steady rhythm of fatherhood. The baby's giggles and growing curiosity were a constant reminder of why Christopher had made this life-altering decision. But even as he embraced his role as a single father, the loneliness crept in. While Oliver filled his days with joy, Christopher couldn't ignore the absence of adult companionship, someone who could truly understand and share the journey he was on. It was at a charity gala that things began to change. Christopher rarely attended such events anymore, but this one was different. It supported an organization providing healthcare to underserved children, a cause that resonated deeply with him since adopting Oliver. As he mingled among the guests, his thoughts drifted back to his son. He checked his phone compulsively, scanning for updates from the nanny. The distraction must have been obvious, as a warm, melodic voice broke through his preoccupation. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere but here," the voice said with a gentle laugh. Christopher looked up and met the gaze of a striking woman with auburn hair and an easy smile. She extended her hand. "Samantha Cooper. I'm on the board for the foundation." He shook her hand, intrigued. "Christopher Brooks. A pleasure to meet you." As they talked, Christopher felt an unfamiliar sense of ease. Samantha, a pediatrician, spoke passionately about her work running a clinic for underprivileged families. Her warmth and sincerity were a refreshing contrast to the superficial conversations that often dominated such events. "What brought you here tonight?" Samantha asked, her curiosity genuine. "My son," Christopher replied without hesitation. "He's the reason I got involved with this foundation." Her eyes lit up with surprise and admiration. "You're a father? How old is he?" Christopher smiled, pulling out his phone to show her a photo of Oliver. "Just over a year. His name is Oliver." Samantha's face softened as she looked at the picture. "He's adorable. You must be so proud." "I am," Christopher said, his voice warm. "He's changed my life in ways I never expected." Their conversation flowed effortlessly, and by the end of the evening, Christopher felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. Over the following weeks, Christopher and Samantha began to see more of each other. Their connection grew slowly, built on shared values and a mutual respect for each other's lives. Samantha's genuine interest in Oliver endeared her to Christopher even more. One sunny afternoon, Christopher invited Samantha to join him and Oliver for a trip to the park. It was Oliver's favorite spot, where he loved watching the ducks in the pond. Samantha crouched beside Oliver, helping him toss breadcrumbs to the eager birds. Her laughter blended with his giggles, and Christopher watched the scene with a mix of admiration and gratitude. "You're good with him," Christopher said as they walked back to the car, Oliver dozing in his stroller. Samantha smiled, adjusting the sun hat on Oliver's head. "He's easy to love." The lump in Christopher's throat took him by surprise. He hadn't realized just how much he had craved this, a partner who not only accepted Oliver but embraced him wholeheartedly. As the weeks turned into months, Samantha became an integral part of their lives. She brought small gifts for Oliver, offered advice on parenting challenges, and brought a sense of balance that Christopher hadn't realized he needed. One evening, as they sat together in the penthouse after putting Oliver to bed, Samantha turned to Christopher. "You know," she said softly, "you're an incredible father. Watching you with Oliver, it's inspiring." Christopher met her gaze, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without him. He's the one who's changed me." Samantha placed a hand on his, her touch grounding him. "And he's lucky to have you." For the first time in years, Christopher felt like he wasn't navigating this journey alone. With Samantha by his side, the future felt brighter, and for the first time, truly complete. Just as Christopher began to settle into his new life with Oliver and Samantha, Bianca resurfaced. One evening, his phone buzzed and her name flashed on the screen. He stared at it for a long moment before answering. "Christopher," she said, her voice hesitant, lacking its usual sharpness. "Can we talk?" He hesitated but agreed. They met at a quiet cafe the next day. When Bianca arrived, she looked different. Her usual polished exterior was gone, replaced by a more subdued, almost fragile appearance. "I've been in therapy," she began, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. "I've been trying to figure out why I couldn't handle being a mother, why I left." Christopher said nothing, his expression unreadable as he waited for her to continue. Bianca took a deep breath. "I think I was scared. Scared of failing, of losing myself. But I've realized that running away was the real failure." Her voice cracked as she admitted, "I've made so many mistakes, and I can't undo them. But I want to try, Christopher. I want to be part of Oliver's life, even if it's just a small part." Christopher's emotions churned. He saw the sincerity in her eyes, the vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. But he couldn't ignore the past, the months of inconsistency, the hurt she had caused. "What do you want, Bianca?" He asked carefully. "To try," she said simply, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want to be there for him. For you." Christopher's jaw tightened as he thought of Oliver, of the stability he had fought so hard to create. "This isn't about you or me," he said finally. "It's about what's best for Oliver, and he needs stability. If you're serious about this, you need to be all in." "I know," Bianca whispered. "I want to be." They agreed to take things slowly. Bianca began supervised visits, building trust with Oliver while keeping her distance from Christopher and Samantha. For a time, the arrangement worked. She seemed genuinely committed, making an effort to bond with her son. But one evening, after weeks of strained progress, Bianca arrived at the penthouse with tears in her eyes. "I can't do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could, but I can't." Christopher's chest tightened as she continued. You've given Oliver everything he needs. He's happy. And Samantha, she's wonderful with him. He doesn't need the confusion of me coming and going. Her words carried a maturity Christopher hadn't seen in her before. He nodded, his voice steady. Thank you for being honest. Bianca leaned down to kiss Oliver's forehead one last time. I'll always love him, she whispered, her tears falling freely. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Christopher stood in the doorway, holding Oliver close as the elevator doors closed behind her. He felt a bittersweet mix of relief and sadness, knowing this chapter had finally come to an end. But as he looked at his son, he knew they would be okay. Together, they had built something stronger than he had ever imagined, a family rooted in love and resilience. Months passed, and life for Christopher and Oliver began to find a steady, joyful rhythm. The echoes of Bianca's departure still lingered, but her decision to step away had brought clarity and peace to their lives. Christopher, once consumed by the relentless demands of his empire, now found his greatest fulfillment in the simple, profound moments of fatherhood. Oliver was thriving, a curious, bright-eyed toddler who filled every corner of their penthouse with laughter and life. Every morning began with his infectious giggles, and every evening ended with the soft hum of a lullaby. Christopher had become an expert at balancing the chaos of parenting with the pressures of his business, though he knew he couldn't have done it alone. Samantha had become an irreplaceable part of their lives. She brought a warmth and balance that Christopher hadn't realized he was missing. Where he was methodical, she was spontaneous. Where he was cautious, she was fearless. Together, they created a home where love and joy thrived, a life that felt authentic and whole. One sunny afternoon, Christopher stood in the backyard of his estate, watching Samantha and Oliver chase each other through the garden. Oliver squealed with delight as Samantha scooped him up, twirling him in the air before planting a playful kiss on his cheek. Christopher's heart swelled as he watched them, the weight of the past finally lifting. You've got a lot of energy for someone his size, Samantha joked, carrying Oliver over to where Christopher stood. Christopher chuckled, reaching out to take his son. He gets it from you, he said, kissing Oliver's head. Samantha smiled, leaning into him. And he gets his determination from you. He's going to be unstoppable. As they stood there, the three of them framed by the golden glow of the setting sun, Christopher felt a profound sense of gratitude. His journey to this moment had been anything but easy, filled with challenges, heartbreak, and hard decisions. Yet, every step had led him here, to a family built on love, resilience, and second chances. Later that evening, as Christopher tucked Oliver into bed, the toddler babbled sleepily, clutching his favorite stuffed bear. Christopher leaned down, brushing a hand gently across his son's cheek. "Good night, buddy," he whispered. "I love you." He lingered for a moment, watching Oliver's chest rise and fall with each peaceful breath. As he closed the nursery door, he felt a quiet sense of triumph. Not the kind measured in financial success or business accolades, but the kind that came from knowing he had given his son the life he deserved. In the months that followed, Christopher's relationship with Samantha deepened. Their bond wasn't built on urgency or fleeting passion, but on mutual respect, shared values, and a genuine partnership. They worked together to create a life where Oliver thrived, each of them fully committed to the family they were building. One evening, as the three of them sat around the dining table, Oliver happily smearing mashed potatoes across his tray, Samantha looked over at Christopher and smiled. "You've done something incredible, you know," she said softly. Christopher raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "You've created a life full of love for him," she said, nodding toward Oliver. "And for us." Christopher reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I didn't do it alone. You've been just as much a part of this as I have." Samantha leaned forward, brushing a kiss against his cheek. "We've done it together, and that's what makes it special." As Oliver let out a delighted squeal, flinging a spoonful of mashed potatoes onto the floor, Christopher and Samantha laughed, the sound filling the room. For the first time in years, Christopher felt an unwavering sense of contentment. His path had been filled with twists and turns, but it had led him to a life he wouldn't trade for anything. In Oliver's laughter, Samantha's warmth, and the quiet moments of their shared lives, Christopher had found his true success, a family worth everything.